I am just simply going to introduce the presenters at the table today. I'm Joy Katz, and oddly I'm going to speak of myself in the third person for a minute. Joy Katz is the author of 3 poetry collections, All You Do Is Perceive, which is coming in October, The Garden Room, and Fabuli. A chapbook called Which From That Time Infused Sweetness will appear in spring from Argos Books. Her awards include a Stegner Fellowship and a recent NEA Fellowship. She teaches in the graduate writing program at Chatham University and lives in Pittsburgh, where she's at work on a manuscript about race and voice called Frayed, F-R-A-Y-E-D, Frayed. I'm also an editor-at-large for Pleiades. And we're going to read alphabetically. So Kathleen Ossip will read next. Kathleen Ossip is the author of The Cold War, which was named one of Publishers Weekly's best books of 2011. The Search Engine, which was selected by Derek Walcott for the American Poetry Review Honickman First Book Prize, and Cinephrastics, a chapbook of movie poems. She teaches at the New School. She was a founding editor of Lit, and she's the poetry editor of Women's Studies Quarterly. She's received a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts. We're sad that Rowan Phillips is not here today. He's quite ill. Sasha Steensen will read next. Sasha is the author of several books of poetry, including A Magic Book and The Method, both from Fence Books. Recent work has appeared in Black Warrior Review, Denver Quarterly, Free Verse, and Bombay Gin. She teaches creative writing at Colorado State University, where she also edits Bonfire Press and serves as a poetry editor for Colorado Review. And Heather Treseler teaches American literature and creative writing at Worcester State University. She was recently an American Academy of Arts and Sciences visiting scholar in the humanities. Her poems and essays appear in Harvard Review, Iowa Review, Notre Dame Review, the Laurel Review, and elsewhere, and she's received fellowships from the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and the Vermont Studio Center. She also serves as a contributing editor to Boulevard. I'm going to speak first, and I just have to tell you I'm getting over laryngitis, so I hope this is loud enough. Okay, good. First, I'm going to play Dream Song 4.
Compact and delicious body with chicken paprika. She glanced at me twice, fainting with interest. My hungered back meant only the fact of her husband and 4 other people kept me from springing on her or falling at her little feet and crying, "You are the hottest one for years of night." Henry's dazed eyes have enjoyed brilliance. My advance upon despairing my spumoni. Now, here comes his friend. Sir Bones is stuffed the world with feeding girls, but Henry hadn't heard him. Black hair, complexion Latin, jeweled eyes downcast, the slob beside her feasts. What wonders is she sitting on over there? The restaurant buzzes. She might as well be on Mars. Where did it all go wrong? There ought to be a law against Henry. Mr. Bones, there is.
So, my little talk is called Terrible Comfort, and I'm going to talk about the black voice in the dream songs. I want to start by saying that I'm really uneasy to sit here at this table and talk about the black voice in the dream songs, because I'm speaking as someone with a white voice and skin privilege. I think of the voice of Henry's unnamed black friend as a necessary point on the imaginative spectrum as I try to approach somehow in my own work with ethics, but also productive risk, race, and voice. And I'll explain what I mean, but it's hard to talk about because what I find in Berryman's this is a quote, undisguised importation of negritude, I find as a white reader, no matter how careful and broad in my thinking or how much empathy I humanly feel, but also because I am sure there are sources I've overlooked on my way, and I trust that you will fill me in. Berryman said these songs were not meant to be understood, they're meant to terrify and comfort. I find the black voice in the songs kind of terrifying, like the prospect of talking about it, and also comforting. Not to argue that Berryman's use of voice that at times sounds like minstrel theater is untroubling. I want to suggest instead that this one voice in the songs might open a place for something now in poetry, for poets who want to think about race and voice rather than not think about it, rather than circle around it, not give up before we envision a way to be intellectually and lyrically ambitious without wounding souls. White poets have been writing about lots of things, not race, and it's safer to keep doing that, except one of my students, she's white, came to me and said, I've been teaching poetry for 2 years in the jails. I don't know how I could ever write about it. And a fiction writer friend who's white says, I've been teaching at an all-black high school for 10 years. I can't possibly bring these experiences to a story. They mean because they're skin-privileged writers trying to make art and manifest not sanctimony and not sentimentality, but empathy across a color line for people over whom they have some power because they're teachers. What are the models for this writing? I believe the Dream Songs is one, and there's at least one other that I will get to. Far in the background of this talk is the fact that I have a young child who is not white, and I think about race a lot. I offer this introduction only because people always ask why it is that I'm thinking about this. As I read the Dream Songs, which I love for their constantly musical, vivid, astonishing, extreme expression, I can't not be aware that I'm reading the black voice as a white. White poets are not exempt from thinking about this. Put a better way, white poets can think and even write about race and voice. This is an opportunity, and it's the legacy of Claudia Rankine and Toni Hoagland's exchange a couple of years ago, which came to wider attention after AWP. Have most people have heard of, okay, this is, okay. All right, so it was a conversation about a poem Toni Hoagland wrote with discomforting images of a black woman tennis player. And Claudia, it was complicated because it was a presentation at AWP, but the conversation, such as it was, took place back in Houston, I think, sometime or even some years before. And she tried to talk to him. Claudia's black, and she tried to talk to him about how she felt really uncomfortable with the images in his poem and thought that they were racist. And he responded, rather unfortunately, I think, that it's a poem for white people. And I mean, there were many angles to this conversation, and I don't want to rewind the debate because I think it's just important that a lot more people started talking about race and voice in poetry following this conversation that happened a couple of years ago. And that American poetry started to change in a way, and that more white poets, at least poets I know, are letting race enter their poems, or trying to, or talking about it. And I think this is important in that it happened because after her exchange with Hoagland, Rankine asked poets a couple of questions. How do we create the linguistic material of racial speech and thought? And if you have never written consciously about race, why have you never felt compelled to do so? Well, Berryman wasn't writing about race any more than he was writing about sex or about drinking or about despair. The Dream Songs don't operate in aboutness. They enact psychic turmoil through voice. I think Berryman, via the voice of the unnamed black friend, accesses a sorrow he can't get to through Henry. And this isn't the only or the chief contribution of the voice, but I'm not willing to part with it in the songs. Trying to imagine the Dream Songs without this voice, they would just be really different. I feel that they would be missing something important. Henry says, life, friends, is boring. The black friend says, I scared a lonely. Henry, the lunatic one, fidgeting with bananas, says, Why can't we all the same be? The black friend says, Dr. Bones, how? I want both these extremes of expression in the songs. Poet James Weldon Johnson said black dialect poetry is limited to two stops, humor and pathos. But the friend in the songs is not funny or pitiful. The black speaker doesn't match any minstrel archetypes. He's not a buffoon, not stupid, lazy, immoral, not a symbol of health and vitality or of the authentic. Rather, this voice registers inauthenticity as a subject of the poems. Both the black friend and blackface minstrel dialect are white inventions, but that truth is productive in the songs. And I'm just going to scrutinize the valence of this black voice for a minute to figure out what it's doing. So here are some different things that happen in the songs. The unnamed black speaker says to Henry, "You seems excited like." So he says some kinds of things that therapists would say. He reflects Henry's emotions back to him. He says, "What happened then?" So the black voice listens and prompts. He says, "Easy, easy, Mr. Bones." The black voice offers comfort. He says, "I smell your grief." The black voice narrates sympathy, but I think empathy is released into the songs at this point because of the historical burden of this black dialect. I have a really long footnote on this because I feel like it's one of the most troubling things I say in this paper. Anyway, I'm happy to talk about that more later. The black friend says, "Sir, we have to die. That is our appointed task." Henry says, "What if I, roiling and babbling and braining, brood on why I must live or kill myself and sit on the fence?" The black voice responds, "The choice is lost." The black voice counsels agency. He says, "I scared a lonely." The black friend offers one of the few emotional confessions in the songs. He says, "Mr. Bones, your troubles give me vertigo." The black voice does not simply react to Henry, but he's physically affected by Henry's mood swings. And so the speaker is therapeutic and empathic. Huffy Henry is the sulker, helpless before ice cream, blenderized cocktails, girls with their vivacious littles, their tops and bottoms and middles. By making the black friend an adult, Berryman undoes the minstrel theater trope of blacks as children in need of white stewardship. One of the book's epigraphs is, "Go in, black man, the day is your own." Berryman locates Henry's black friend insanity in reason in daylight. If the songs are dream hallucinations, the black voice marks the place where we cry ourselves awake. This is one way Berryman transforms the dialect rather than simply importing it, and there are a couple more. There's not merely one singular black dialect in the songs. Over time, the voice shifts away from broad-stroke vaudeville in Song 2 to a looser vernacular. And by Song 40, the voice draws close to what might be a blues song by Leadbelly. And here's a little excerpt. "Wishin' was dyin', but I gotta make it all this way to that bed on these feet where people said to meet. Maybe, but even if I see my son, forever never, get back on the take. Free, black, and 41. By Song 50, the voice has shifted again dramatically. And here's another tiny excerpt. "I feel as if the roses of dawns and pearls of dusks, made up by some old writer man, got right forgot, and the greennesses of hours." This sounds like Berryman pushing Shakespeare through Andrew Marvell, then through a kind of speech filter like an app. The result is a high-low lyric invention. The masks, black and white, are so complicated that I can't sort them out, which I think bears out Berryman's desire for what he called new forms in which ancient forms appear. I think it's one of the most extreme expressions in the songs. I'm still slow to be able to imagine a distantly related strategy for my work. But if we, meaning any of us here who are writers, are going to use voice in writing, what language can and can't our poems contain? If we make a fence around an idiolect, a dialect, or a diction, if we say, you don't have access to it, or we no longer use this, or there's no way to use this ethically, if we say keep away from language that you or someone, white, black, other, was forced into an unethical contract with, then we make our poems safe. If we always distance ourselves via meta-narratives, we risk limiting ourselves to a poetics of guilt. If we hold fast to our disapproval of voice, then our judgment may come through in the writing, and our poems go around quietly in rubber nurses' shoes. I think any voice that is the voice of a poet's consciousness can enter a poem, even if I'm not sure yet of the ways this can happen. Voice is the radioactive material of racial thought. If we avoid its extremes, perhaps we foreclose an opportunity to express, as Henry's friend implies, we can't all the same be. We should be discomforted, but not terrified, to do this in our moment. But how? The first epigraph in 77 Dream Songs says, "Thou drawest near in the day." That's the line from Lamentations. Berryman draws near sorrow by mixing a blackface voice up with his own in Song 2. In the day, if we attempt anything similar, we need to be awake to the implications, and I think Berryman was. It's not comfortable to draw close. In the recording that we just heard of Dream Song 4, before the black voice speaks, Berryman stops reading the poem, right, to say to the audience, now here comes his friend. Flip there. Now here comes his friend. Berryman offers this soft aside to the audience, and it's a tiny but critical form of responsibility, a little meta-narrative. And so I wonder who was in the audience? Just white people who went to poetry readings in the early 60s at the Guggenheim. Because Berryman stopped and explained, no one listening could think he wasn't aware of the charge that black dialect brings with it. To hear him read this song, he seems kind of self-conscious. He doesn't perform as a white and blackface. He reads the lines more or less as Berryman, only not as confidently as when channeling Henry. And as far as I can tell, Berryman seems to have recorded only one of the songs with the black dialect, this song. Maybe he was limiting his extremist expression to the page, and maybe this is a boundary to consider. So who's doing risk-taking work with voice right now? What models do we have? C.D. Wright, I think, is one. In her book, One Big Self, incorporates black voices from prisons in Louisiana. Wright doesn't, and she's white, by the way, if you don't know her, Wright doesn't appropriate exactly. It's clear she's quoting the prisoners, except when it's not. At times, it's hard to tell which lines come from Wright and which come from the prisoners, who are almost all black. Their dictions draw close together because as you read the book, the rules of the book change slightly. The prisoners' names are at first noted, then gradually they're not. And the margin shifts that mark dialogue at first later don't always mark dialogue, so that at times it seems to be Wright's voice or thoughts interposed with those of the prisoners, which is really kind of amazing that she's able to enter into linguistic communitarianism with incarcerated black men and women. She makes of herself and them and us one big self, as opposed to Berryman's one big selves. And she does this partly through voice. And she uses diction shifts kind of like Berryman does. One key strategy in that book is a shift to high diction when details of prisoners' crimes. I don't know if you've ever read this book, but there are details of really gruesome murders and torture in the book. So she, everything is included in this book. And so every time the detail, really gruesome details of a crime happen in the book, there's this refrain: how can that be shriven? It's kind of Shakespearean. How can that be shriven? Allows for the possibility that the worst human cruelties could be shriven somehow by some agency, only not the poet. So in the book, C.D. Wright is a register of pain, not an absolver, which is also true of the unnamed friend in the songs. It functions the same way. How can that be shriven? If Wright had written, I can't shrive that, the book would be totally different. And a model that goes the other way, a black poet drawing close to the psyche of a white person, I think is Cornelius Eady's Brutal Imagination. In that book, Eady imagines Susan Smith, the white woman who invented a black kidnapper to cover up her own murder of her 2 children. He does this in order to take on the persona of the imaginary kidnapper, the black man. In so doing, he brings me, a white reader, close to his consciousness and experience. But also, in his drawing close, he accesses, amazingly and with compassion, Smith's motives. Although Eady never speaks as Smith, Susan Smith is always referred to in the third person. So it's not exactly the same act of imagination as Berryman's. It's a conscious, risk-taking proximity. The book could have been a condemnation. It could have been merely angry. It is neither. It's really complicated. So I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about my own work just for a minute, because I'm wrestling with a piece of extreme expression that I've been thinking about for a couple of years. So one day I was sitting in my apartment, a tiny studio in the East Village, while the studio next door was being gut renovated. The crew was 2 white men and 1 black. They started to argue, and through the wall I heard the black voice say, "I know I'm black and I'm stupid, but..." There were registers of humiliation and anger in this voice, and he sounded near tears. So that line, in the years I've thought about it, has come to shine a harsh light on the intricately constructed language of my whiteness, a series of contracts I entered into from childhood without realizing it. One such binding agreement, because I grew up with a kind of liberal social justice type of whiteness, is that I will never say to a black person or even think in my head the words, "you're black" and "you're." So I have this impulse to restore the dignity of this voice, except the urge to restore dignity itself feels like a kind of violent renovation, which, because it involves considering what this voice said as a kind of truth. But I can't allow or imagine a truth that contains a black voice saying, "I'm black and I'm stupid." So my rush to compassion that's encoded in my whiteness, my language contract, only leads to further indignity, a desire to cancel the man out, whatever he was saying. I haven't figured out how this voice can possibly operate in a poem. But if I do, it'll be partly because I remember that the black voice, with its compromised diction, is the source of all the dignity in the dream songs. That's it. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the book, 77 Dream Songs, as a book. Consider it as a book. And my talk is titled I, he, as in the pronouns, okay? I, he, Berryman's 77 Dream Songs, and Why the Book Won't Die. When I reread 77 Dream Songs recently, what struck me and pleased me most about it was its bookliness, the qualities that make it feel like a book. This made me realize that bookliness, the aggregation of qualities that make a volume a book, is one of the reasons I love 77 Dream Songs and why it means so much to me. Except for nursery rhymes, I loved books before I loved poetry. A book is an object, a material possession full of pleasure and permanence. The physical presence, or the 3D-ness of a volume, is enough to suggest that the experience of reading will yield to the experience of having read, having entered into a singular unified world. So, and if you add the 4th dimension, which is the time it takes you to experience the book, and a 5th, which might be a narrative unity, and if you add those 5 dimensions together, you have, I think, what I'm calling bookliness. Making a book is an extreme act because it's a lie or a craziness. It's a lie in service of truth, a crazy mistake. It suggests that it is possible to mark the beginning, middle, and end of a human story, unlike a real life, which is all middle. It also suggests that all of the events and experiences that take place at a given time relate to the book's central figure and narrative. In 1964, there were far fewer project or concept or thematically cohesive books in the world of poetry than there are now. Some bemoan the glut of project books that now get a lot of attention in the poetry publishing world. As a book lover, I don't bemoan. Along with the crazy quilt dictions in the Dream Songs, which Joy talked about, I think the interest in the book of poems as a book is one of Berryman's legacies. In a list of notable books of U.S. poetry published that year, the only ones that have any kind of conceptual framing are Ted Berrigan's The Sonnets and Frank O'Hara's Lunch Poems. And not only were those poets operating out of a whole different tradition, their bookliness relied on form, the sonnets, and on occasion, lunch poems. Neither of those books have anything like the narrative profluence, the fictional flow forward of 77 Dream Songs. There had been life studies, of course, in 1959, but to my reader's ear and heart, it's not nearly as fictional and book-like as 77 Dream Songs. It's more an extension, exciting at the time, of the more traditional academic lyricist's songs of his exterior life passed through his interior filter. Berryman did not have Lowell's great advantage, his family's historical allure. As Elizabeth Bishop said to Lowell in a letter, "I could write in as much detail about my Uncle Artie, say, but what would be the significance? Whereas all you have to do, Robert Lowell, is put down the names." Maybe that's partly why Berryman had to fictionalize, to zets up his story and make it snap into bookliness. In 1959, there was also Heart's Needle by W.D. Snodgrass. This is a little closer in bookliness to 77 Dream Songs, in that it did have a plot, the divorce plot. But the plot wasn't complicated by any pretense about disruption in the lyric I, who undoubtedly equaled Snodgrass. Berryman's book was more book-like because it was more fictional. Fiction is the genre that has the most inherent bookliness. A lyric is a song. It hangs in the air. A story must be contained within covers, because not only its sensation, but its details must be remembered as a unity. If I is the lyric pronoun, he is a fictional pronoun. Fiction is the genre that has the most inherent bookliness. Berryman's famous split self, which Joy talked about, signals that this is a novelesque book of poetry. What ties it to lyric and gives it the Zets factor is that the reader knows that Henry does equal Berryman in some way, as much as Berryman denies it. A book has an immediate cultural authority that a lyric, even a volume of lyrics, doesn't have. The etymology of the word book shows this. It comes from an Old English word that means a document or a charter. But there is another method. That's one of the epigraphs to 77 Dream Songs by Olive Schreiner. But there is another method. That suggests a lot of things to me. The multi-voice method, the leapy logic, the leapy narrative chronology, but also I think it associates with the bookliness of the book, a book that, as the front note tells us, is Proustian, in that we expect follow-up volumes. There are sections, says the front note, these are sections constituting one version of a poem in progress. Berryman said, "I set up the Dream Songs as hostile to every visible tendency in both American and English poetry." This is from Robert Lowell's review of 77 Dream Songs in the New York Review of Books. "The poems are about Berryman, or rather they are about a person he calls Henry. Henry is Berryman seen as himself, as poet maudit, child and puppet. He is tossed about with a mixture of tenderness and absurdity, pathos and hilarity that would have been impossible if the author had spoken in the first person, underscoring the fictive bookliness. For pure bookliness, you'd have to go back to the 19th century, Berryman thought. He said, "I think the model in the dream songs was the other greatest American poem. I am very ambitious. Song of Myself, a very long poem, about 60 pages. It also has a hero, a personality, himself. Henry is accused of being me, and I am accused of being Henry. And I deny it, and nobody believes me." And I think that's the crux. I deny it, and nobody believes me. He needed to have both, and that's part of what makes it fictional and bookly. Various other things entered into it, he says, but that is where I started. A book is a fictional, character-driven narrative. 77 Dream Songs is a fictional, character-driven narrative. From the very beginning of the book, Dream Song 1, we have the narrator and the protagonist, the I and the he, as separate characters, a la The Great Gatsby. These are just a couple of lines from Dream Song 1. I don't see how Henry, pried open for all the world to see, survived. There's no uncomplicated reason for the split, and a lot has been written and said about it. But among other things, this signals that the book is fiction, which doesn't mean unfactual. In this case, it means shapely, it means authoritative, and permanent, a document or a charter. Let I stand for I, the frantic confrontation with the inadequacy of the inner life to confront the outer personal and cultural chaos. Let he stand for he, the sharp wit of this confrontation and the gallows humor. The chronology of 77 Dream Songs is bookly. It is a journey that proceeds. What journey is it? The mid-century confessional narrative par excellence. The breakdown plot, we might call it. One sensitive person reacts to the dysfunction of his time and place and cracks. I believe this mid-century breakdown narrative was never told more completely or compellingly than in this book. There is often an element of boredom in volumes of poetry. You expect or even require a certain amount of lulls of attention when you read many pages of poetry. Those lulls are where you go inward to test your own experience in the context of the lyric that you're reading. Boredom was famously at issue for Berryman. We all know the lines, "Life, friends, is boring, we must not say so." 77 Dream Songs is never boring. It does have the snap and zets of a popular novel. And it was one of the few poetry books of the time that was a Book of the Month Club selection. Incredible to imagine. It is driven not only by narrative and character, but by dialogue, as we poets call it, by voice. Just as we expect conversation in a novel, the interplay of voices lends 77 Dream Songs the texture of fiction. A book has an ending, which is part of what makes it a satisfying experience. My favorite books of poetry both end and open at the final moment, suggesting that the book ends, but that we are immortal, because we go on, changed and new, after we finish the book. This is an incomparable sensation. Berryman's book ends with the 77th Dream Song, which uses the image of the book as an emblem for the link between past and future. The final poem begins by looking back. Seedy Henry rose up shy in the world, and forward, with a book of his in either hand, he is stripped down to move on. Henry clutching a book in each hand is the poem's motif and the book's destiny. There are 308 more Dream Songs to come after all, and another fatter book. At the end of the poem, Henry is clutching his own mad books, like talismans or like fuel for the fires in his eyes, head, and heart. These are the final lines. It is a wonder that, within each hand, one of his own mad books and all, Ancient fires for eyes, his head full and his heart full. He's making ready to move on. And I want to let JB have the last word, so let's listen to that final dream song.
Then I'll read the last one, or the one that for about 5 years has stood last. C.D. Henry rose up shy and de-world, and shaved and swung his barbells, dutied Henry up, and PA'd poor thousands of persons on topics of grand moment to Henry, to those less and none. With a book of his in either hand, he is stripped down to move on. Henry is tired of the winter and haircuts and a squeamish, comfy, ruin-prone, proud national mind and spring in the city so-called. Henry likes fall. He would be prepared to live in a world of fall forever. Impenitent Henry? But the snows and summers grieve and dream. These fierce and airy occupations and love raved away so many of Henry's years. It is a wonder that within each hand, one of his own mad books and all, ancient fires for eyes, his head full and his heart full, he's making ready to move on. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
I'm going to use the podium even though I don't love them because the bit I'm going to read is in the middle of my or the bit I'm going to play is in the middle of my paper. And it picks up really, I hope, nicely from where Kathleen left off because it's dealing with structure, but in most cases when I say the dream songs in my paper, I'm referring to the 385, but I do occasionally refer to the 77, so I'll mention that specifically. The paper's called The Plastic and the Rigid, Dreaming and Teaching, Structure, and John Berryman's Dream Songs. And it begins with an epigraph from Lynn Hygenian's The Rejection of Closure. The writer experiences a conflict between a desire to satisfy a demand for boundedness, for containment and coherence, and a simultaneous desire for free, unhampered access to the world, prompting a corresponding open response to it. I usually begin my graduate poetry writing workshops with the study of a dead poet. Because the majority of the semester is spent considering the work of living poets, both the students in the class and other contemporary American poets, I am not reluctant to spend a few weeks paying homage to the dead. Twice I've started with Berryman. Graduate students, especially writers, graduate student poetry writers, are obviously hungry to understand how to put a book together. And so, in both cases, the discussion pretty quickly came around to the overall structure of the dream songs. In one case, a second-year student who had heard me claim you must teach your readers how to read your book very smartly asked, okay, what are we to do with the 3 truncated quotes at the beginning of the 77 dream songs? He wanted to know, what kind of information do these questions give us about the larger book? How do they serve as entrance points? A great question, so let's start with it. John Berryman begins his 77 dream songs with 3 epigraphs, interestingly, all already mentioned. The first unattributed quotation, "Go in, Brackman, de days you own," appears to be an amalgam, part quote from Moby Dick, part echo of the minstrel show. The second, from Lamentations, is halved. The first half of the verse is omitted and replaced by ellipses, and we are only left with "I am their music." The third, borrowed from Victorian novelist Olive Schreiner, simply reads, "But there is another method." Each of these quotes makes a case for the fragment, The first fusing fragments from two different texts, the second forming a fragment via omission, and the third allowing the coordinating conjunction but to point to the incomplete nature of the quote. As entrance points, these epigraphs ask us to perform a kind of synthesis, albeit an incomplete one, whereby these fragmented quotes work together to form some sense of the larger movement and concerns of the dream songs. Perhaps this synthesis is akin, in some ways, to the act of processing dreams in our waking lives. Upon awakening, we often bring the disparate elements of a dream to bear on one another in hopes of uncovering some larger understanding, which is a favorite word in the dream songs. And to some extent, we are often able to construct meaningful narratives out of the fragmented dream. But there always seems to be some element of the dream that doesn't cohere to our narratives. As Berryman seems to suggest via Schreiner's quote, we may need another method, one whose goal is not understanding, but experiencing. In a late dream song, he writes, "The pitcher dreamed. He threw a hazy curve. I took it in my stride and out I struck. Lonesome Henry." These songs aren't meant to be understood, you understand. They are only meant to terrify and comfort. Lilac was found in his hand. Lilac was found in Whitman's hand, the hand that taught Berryman what it meant to write a long poem. In an interview conducted in July of 1970, Berryman is asked about the structural notion of the dream songs. To which he responds, "I think the model in the dream songs was Song of Myself, a very long poem, about 60 pages. It has a hero, a personality, himself." He goes on to add that the dream songs proceeded along lines that were partly preconceived and partly developing as I went along, sometimes rigid and sometimes plastic structural notions. Though it might seem from this quote that Berryman was comfortable with the oscillation between the plastic and the rigid, other comments in his notebooks, in interviews, and in public readings suggest otherwise. Let's listen for a minute to Berryman's 1962 introduction of the dream songs. Okay.
I think I've said enough about this. The working title for this poem has been for years The Dream Songs. It's rather lengthy. There are now about 150 of them, fully revised, and several hundred others in different kinds of condition. And I'm sort of beginning to publish them. But most of them have, of course, not appeared yet. I'm not going to read them in anything like their actual sequence, for various reasons. It's hard to listen to new poems, and apparently this poem is difficult to take in. The style is unusual. Friends of mine, I have written, in a way, this is the unveiling of Henry this afternoon. How small can an occasion get? I have read a half dozen in Washington last couple of weeks ago when there was a circus, and some in California and Chicago and other places. But I've never read as many as I'm going to read today. I'm going to read today just as many as I can. I hope you're feeling patient. But my friends tell me that a few of them don't work. That is to say, until you get accustomed to Henry and his very strange way of thinking and feeling, you just feel as if you've been led into a nut house. And also, people's responses to them are very different. For example, well, the best reader of them in the country is Saul Bellow. And Saul and I show Saul a new one, and we kill ourselves laughing. Then I read to other people. They cry. That is to say, there's something wrong about these songs. And I say this not by way of recommending them. I admit that they're crazy. Well, I'm going to change the order. That is, I'm going to ignore completely their actual order in the poem. The sections, by the way, are short. Each one consists of 3 6-line stanzas. That's 18 lines. Generally 5-5-3, 5-5-3, with various rhyme schemes. I'm going to do them in a sort of thematic way. That is, I'm starting out with the first one, which is a narrative, and I'm going to wind up with the last two, which are narrative. But in between, I'm going to take them in terms of themes. I think they make it easier to listen to. There are two about, so that gives us 3 narrative ones. Then there are 2 concerning travel, and there are several concerning love or something resembling it. I'm only going to read one of them, I think. Then there's some political ones or national songs. I'm going to read 4 of them. Then there are a number of religious ones. I'll read 3 of them. And in several, Henry appears to be seriously depressed. I want to read 3 of them. They're among the best of all. Then there are a number concerning art and several concerning death. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see how our time is. Well, we have half an hour. I can't read that many. I'll do what I can. I have to read the...
Okay. So what I'm really interested in that long introduction to the poems is the anxiety that I detect there about the overall structure of the project. In hopes of forging cohesion for the dream songs as a whole, Berryman made notes and charts that proposed organizing the songs in various ways, including moving seasonally to moving through a series of activities which he identified as departure, initiation, and return. In April 1959, he admits that he, quote, never yet really faced the fundamental interdependence and sequence essential to the notion of a long poem. Like Berryman in our recording, early critics, at a loss to find clear overarching structures, tended to find contextual cohesion of various sorts. In her 1964 review for The Nation, Adrienne Ritz insists, it is the personality of Henry which holds the book together, makes it clearly a real book, and not a collection of chance pieces loosely flung together under one cover. 16 years later, critics were still looking to thematic consistencies across the poems to explain the dream song's lack of structural cohesiveness. In 1980, John Haffenden published a chapter exploring Berryman's various structuring attempts, concluding finally that cohesion in the dream songs can be found in Berryman's consistent, almost obsessive considerations of theology and the Godhead. Haffenden concedes, quote, the plot and structure may be seen as the conduct of an inquiry which is coherent enough to give the poem a type of structure. Even though thematic harmony is not quite structural unity, it is no less functional, end quote. In discussions with my students, I found myself asking, is thematic harmony really as functional as structural unity? Is Berryman hoping that we might be willing to forego structural unity if thematic harmony is in place? Or more simply, what is the relationship in this book between structure and theme, or form and content? Berryman famously says of the dream songs, it has no plot. Its plot is the personality of Henry as he moves on in the world. But as you will remember from our recording, Henry has a very strange way of thinking and feeling that makes it seem, from the reader's perspective, that she has been led into a nut house. So, what bearing might Henry's strange way of feeling and thinking have had on Berryman's inability to forge an overall structure for the book, or his at least sense of his inability to do so? Though we all know that Berryman attempted to distance himself from the character of Henry, at other times he seemed more willing to accept some connection. In a December 1957 journal entry, Berryman admitted, I am a strange man, not unitary like other people. I am really Henry Pussycat, and I am also a bastard. And I am hopeful and good-natured, and I am a man injured and insulted. If the conflicted personality of Henry, based loosely on Berryman's own, is the plot to the dream songs, and if, as Charles Olson and Robert Creeley insist, there ought to be some relationship between form and content, perhaps searching for structural unity in the dream songs is misguided in the first place. At the same time, I'm not comfortable simply substituting thematic harmony for structural unity, and furthermore, I'm not even sure that I would characterize the dream songs as thematically harmonious. Though Berryman may not have been able to rid himself of lurking concerns about the absence of structural unity, perhaps, as the third epigraph suggests, he embraced Olive Schreiner's other method, one in which Henry's strange way of thinking and feeling might take precedence over an immediately apparent structural cohesion. But how does this other method, my students might ask, help us learn to read this confounding book? Here's the longer passage from which Berryman takes Oliver Schreiner's epigraph. Quote, human life may be painted according to 2 methods. There is the stage method, in which we know with an immutable certainty that at the right crisis, each one will act its part, and when the curtain falls, all will stand before it bowing. There is a sense of satisfaction in this and of completeness, but there is another method. Here, nothing can be prophesied. There is a strange coming and going of feet. Men appear, act, and react upon each other, and pass away. When the crisis comes, the man who would fit it does not return. When the curtain falls, no one's ready. When the footlights are brightest, they are blown out, and what the name of the play is, no one knows." End quote. This other method seems to be one of uncertainty, of unexpectedness, of incompleteness, and Berryman is in pursuit of it. He longs to paint human life generally, and Henry's specifically, according to this other method, one that, to some extent, resists narrative chronology and causality. Just as the speaker in Song of Myself is meant to encompass multitudes, so is Henry meant to be complicated and conflicted rather than unitary. Whitman seemed unconcerned with an overarching structural unity, and as readers, we've become comfortable with Whitman's ability to move from section to section without clear chronological or narrative sequencing. For Whitman, containing multitudes precipitated a willingness to forgo classical epic structures in favor of episodic sectioning. For Berryman, the fragmentation of the poetic subject, and perhaps even more specifically, the fragmentation of the dream, necessitated poetic fragmentation of various sorts, including syntactical, paratactical, and structural fragmentation. As readers, we must grapple with this fragmentation just as Henry does, and we must resist the tendency to impose understanding at the expense of experiencing. In other words, we must be willing to employ, just as Berryman has, Schreiner's other method. In Dream Song 137, Berryman writes, "I don't understand this dream," said Henry to himself in Slippers. "Why, things are going to pieces." Just as the Dream Song's fragmented epigraphs appear to be going to pieces, so is Henry's contrarian personality. The book must be plastic enough to accommodate these pieces without unifying them. At the same time, we can't overlook the fact that Berryman pairs this plasticity with rigidity. Where are we to find the rigid structural notions he mentions in the Paris Review interview? And why have so many critics been unable to see this rigidity anywhere other than on a thematic or contextual plane? Perhaps this rigidity is a purloined letter of sorts, right under our noses, in the individual poem rather than in the trajectory of the book overall. The Dream Songs are highly structured, formal poems made up of 3 6-line stanzas with varying number of feet, but with a reoccurring pattern of 2 lines of feet, 5 feet, followed by a line of 3 feet, and so on, as we heard Berryman describe it in the introduction to the Dream Songs that we listened to. It feels to me that the stanzaic and metrical insistence of these poems constitutes an attempt to hold together that which threatens to disintegrate at every turn. What we have, then, is what Berryman calls in Dream Song 134 a wrestle of undoing, a struggle between cohesion and chaos, the same struggle that is at the heart of Henry's strange way of thinking and feeling. But is it so strange, or might we find analogies in other areas of human experience? It seems to me that dreaming is one such place where cohesion and chaos are able to coexist. And though we might privilege the latter over the former, the dream holds tightly to the irrational. To conclude, by returning to my own epigraph from Lynn Hygenian, the writer with her desire to satisfy a demand for containment and coherence, and her simultaneous desire for free, unhampered access to the world, faces this choice between the more familiar method and Schreiner's other method. Berryman, like so many writers I admire, chooses not to force experience into a coherent, cohesive narrative, but rather he answers this experience with a corresponding open response to it. Thanks.
Okay. There is a handout floating around. Hopefully most of you found one as you came in. Joy and Kathy and Sasha all spoke quite beautifully about Berryman's work, mostly in the 60s and 70s. And I'd like you to do a bit of time travel with me and actually go back to 1948, before Berryman's breakthrough. The question that I had when I went to Berryman's archive this past December was, how do we get from the Yeatsian traditionalist volume, The Dispossessed, in 1948, which got very little critical attention and certainly did not establish Berryman as the poet we know now,
and the outright wildness that we encounter in Homage to Mr. Bradstreet just 5 years later in 1953, when it first appeared in the Partisan Review. Berryman seemed to think that he was very concerned with the question of influence, and he kept asking himself in 1948 who his fathers were, and in fact who his grandfathers were in terms of literary influence. What I'm going to suggest in my brief presentation today is that Berryman probably shouldn't have been asking who his grandpa was, but in fact looking more closely at whom his mother was. So the title of this talk is Dear Jill, Dear Jackass, which were both terms that he used in addressing his mother. The second half of the title is Berryman's Mother Muse. My talk is relatively short. It has 4 sections, and the first section is called Who's Your Grandpa? The young poets today, in short, have not had fathers, but grandfathers, John Berryman surmised in his essay, Poetry Chronicle, 1948, Waiting for the End, Boys. Dismissing his generation's putative fathers, John Crow Ransom, Mark Van Doren, with whom he studied at Columbia, and Alan Tate, as limited and ultimately parochial in their influence, Berryman cited Auden, Wallace Stevens, and Marianne Moore as his generation's true primogenitors. The grandfathers, and the one venerable grandmother in the figure of Marianne Moore, who had influenced what he termed young work. 34 years old in 1948, Berryman was intent on constructing a literary genealogy for his generation, a family tree of poetic influence in which his own largely ignored first book, The Dispossessed, which was aptly titled, might find its rightful bow, its self-possession. But the question of literary influence and critics' perennial and often annoying identification of schools, coteries, and rivals on the poetic playground does not account for the influences more privately psychological, more quotidian, that in Berryman's case had as much influence on his development of a signature style than what Berryman described in 1948 as, quote, the ominous, social, and frightening Auden climate of the 1930s, co-populated as it was by Wallace Stevens, the Warren clerisy of T.S. Eliot, and the long, cooling shadow of W.B. Yeats. As if diagnosing himself and the Yeatsian debt of his own first collection, Berryman wagers that the new critics' homogenization of their modernist forebears had, quote, made it possible for a hat rack to write a perfectly presentable poem on any standard subject. With some exceptions, even with some degree of critical sympathy, much of Berryman's Dispossessed, his first full-length collection, is haberdashery. To make the breakthrough from what we might think of as old hat into the fresh novelty of Homage to Mr. Bradstreet and 77 Dream Songs, Berryman would have to turn to other, more potent sources much closer to home. Which brings us to part 2, Mother Matters. While poets have their peers, their predecessors, and even their pedagogues, they also have their parents. In Berryman's case, his mother, whom he alternately addressed as in his letters as Little Mother, Jill Angel, Darling, Dearest Mum, Dearest Jill, and Jackass, was perhaps more his provocateur than any other person in his life. Indeed, the young Berryman addressed his very first 4 poems, 4 sonnets on the occasion of her 40th birthday, to his mother. And their obsessive correspondence, begun in 1928 when Berryman was just 14, continued avidly for 43 years, producing well over 700 letters. To date, less than a third of their correspondence has appeared in print. Richard Kelly's 1988 edition of their letters features just 221, including only 19 of Jill's letters to her son and 12 previously unpublished poems. Until very recently, Kate Donahue, Berryman's widow and literary executor, has largely restricted access, and with good reason, to the Berryman's other unpublished letters, which I'll contend reveal much more about the poet's modes, muse, and his all-important mid-career breakthrough. A quick biographical digression so we can understand who Jill Berryman was. Much like her son, Jill Berryman, who was born Martha Shaver Little in 1894, was principally raised by her mother after her father abandoned the family when she was just 5 years old. And here we might think of the empathic parallel and shared experience of abandonment that Berryman constructs in stanza 2 of Homage when he writes, quote, "We are on each other's hands, both of our worlds unhanded us." Markedly precocious, Jill graduated from high school well before her 15th birthday and attended a 2-year college, graduating valedictorian and being voted most brilliant in her class. She married a bank manager, perhaps the first of many big mistakes, John Allen Smith, at age 18, and they soon had 2 sons, John and his younger brother, Robert Jefferson. After the families moved to Florida during the real estate boom and bust of the 1920s and her husband's tragic suicide in 1926, Jill very quickly, and in fact very suspiciously quickly, remarried John Angus Berryman, a bond salesman, resettling him with him in New York. When this second husband's career subsequently sputtered, Jill began working as a secretary, gradually ascending the corporate ladder to become a successful executive in both women's fashion and in advertising. But John Berryman, her gifted son, was arguably the product Jill would most obsessively fashion and competitively advertise. And here on your handout on the first page, you'll see a letter that she wrote, I believe, to Life magazine, basically trying to get them to give some press to Homage to Mrs. Bradstreet, a poem that I think she believed was addressed to her and was all about her. And it may have been. Offering him extensive personal, financial, and social support well into his adulthood, Jill Berryman assessed her son's writing, corresponded with his college professors, can we say helicopter parent, would-be collaborators and wives, both with and without his knowledge. She praised his achievements, she goaded his ambition, and comforted him when met with publishers' rejection. And you'll see on the handout in the second letter on the first page, she's comforting him about having Homage to Mrs. Bradstreet rejected by Viking. Meanwhile, she also complained to him of real or imagined slights, subtly asserting manipulative control over his decisions and generally outstripping the influence of at least 2 of Berryman's 3 wives. Indeed, Jill served as one of Berryman's primary readers, as well as his de facto literary agent, his long-distance marital counselor, his nursemaid, his spiritual advisor, and, very importantly, his family historian. Her candid confidences in him, meanwhile, about her spiritual struggles, her novenas, her penances, her sins, her finances, business prospects, and social life, her anxiety disorders, diet plans, and other physical woes, all regularly trespass what we might recognize as normal maternal filial bounds. While a generally chaste portion of the Berryman's correspondence appears in Kelly's We Dream of Honor, their unpublished letters detail far more of the story, by turns riveting and sordid. Okay, I'm going to cut out a sort of more theoretical piece here and just cut right to the juicier chase. So this third section is called Homage, quote, backwards out of reality and sideways out of invention. Historically, critics have read Berryman's breakthrough volume, Homage to Mrs. Bradstreet, in connection with Sonnets to Chris, and the sustained adulterous affair in Princeton, New Jersey that Berryman recorded in that latter volume. Now we'll remember that Sonnets to Chris was written in 1947, but because it was about an adulterous affair, he wisely didn't publish it until after the dissolution of that marriage. In fact, I think it might have been after the dissolution of the second, in 1967. Berryman's seductive seance of the colonial poet Anne Bradstreet, 17th century poet often regarded as the first poet in America, in Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, does indeed contain specific parallels to Sonnets to Chris, including one shared line, one crucial shared line, "I want to take you for my lover," which is spoken by the character of Lyle in Sonnets and Bradstreet in stanza 32 of Homage. Yet I would argue that the dominant concerns of Berryman's Bradstreet more closely parallel those of his mother's than those of an adulterous Princeton suburbanite, and his poetic cleaving to and from Bradstreet's legacy and Homage enacts the dialogic drama of individuation that had already begun to occur in his correspondence with his mother, Jill Angel. In a published letter dating back to 1947, and this appears on the second page of your handout, Berryman confided in his mother his gross dislike of the dispossessed. Now, this is his first full-length collection, and he can't stand it as he's editing it. And his inability, moreover, to countenance anyone in his state of nervous despair. Quote, "I go nowhere and see no one, can't talk," he writes. "My book disgusts me, and in consequence, this revision is proceeding very slowly and stupidly like an incompetent dressing a corpse." Ironically, Berryman's next published volume would, in fact, feature the addressing, dressing, and dramatic undressing of a corpse composed of his own projections and obsessive maternal relationship in the figure of Anne Bradstreet's centuries-dead body. In stanza 35, just after Berryman's narrator describes himself poignantly as, quote, "entirely alone, a man of griefs and fits, trying to be my friend," he has a strangely intimate, visceral encounter with Bradstreet's conjured body. Quote, "And the brown smock splits down the pale flesh, a gash broadens, and time holds up your heart against my eyes." Sexy or gross, I'm not sure which. Maybe it was both. While the persona of Berryman's Bradstreet earlier demands that he kiss and talk to her in stanza 30 and not cease in his conversational and amorous intentions, it is Berryman's male narrator who conjures the tearing of her dress and the tearing of her flesh, revealing in this monstrance of trans-historical time her heart to his eyes. No longer an incompetent, a writer without his own identifiable poetic style, Berryman undresses the symbolic body of America's first poet in Homage, claiming in his worship to see into the core of her heart and her sensibility. This trope of digging up a dead woman's body, just as an aside, is re-echoed in Dream Song number 42, which is explicitly dedicated to his mother, and which contains, or begins, "O journeyer, deaf in the mold, insane, with violent travel and death, consider me in my first cast your son," which to me, having spent some time with Homage, seems like a direct echoing, really, of Berryman's address of Bradstreet. In writing Homage, as Berryman later explained, explicitly against the model of T.S. Eliot's Eurocentric wasteland, Berryman not only took America's first poet and touted 10th Muse as his channeling agent, but he also added something new to the epic poem Equation, an ingredient that he describes in an unpublished essay entitled Africa, the first page of which appears on the last page of your handout. Quote, "The storyteller looks back. It is in this sense that all good stories are true. Why does he look back? Surely out of desire for a difference in the past or present or for the future itself, and therefore all good stories are untrue. And therefore stories are difficult to write, created equally backward out of reality and sideways out of invention, mixing in the phrase of a modern poet, mixing memory and desire. Yet I am bound to mention at once something else. Besides desire, and by no means incompatible with it, I have an idea that indignation, or the general motive of rejection, plays a larger role in the inspiration of more works of modern narrative art than critics suspect and authors are inclined to reveal. Mixing then may be memory and desire and contempt or rage. An homage seems an odd place in which to put or disinter one's rage and rejection, but the project begun in Berryman's very first poem at age 19, addressed to his mother, quote, "I sing of a mother's love, too strong to hold unto herself her son, though they were two so near in mind and heart," reaches a turning point in homage when Berryman conjures a version of his neurotic, overreaching mother in the figure of Bradstreet and attempts to place her provisionally in the ground, while promising in the final stanza to maintain, quote, "a love that has no body." Lyrically acknowledging but syntactically displacing America's poetic mother in the concluding stanza of Homage, Berryman pledges to maintain Bradstreet's quote-unquote ages for as so long as I happen, a poignant promise of continuing legacy that a son might offer his actual literary-minded mother within a poetic mask. But it is also a pledge that he might offer his American peers, seeking in the post-war Cold War moment to define and to reify a literary culture principally American. Indeed, when Jill Berryman received the poem, she read it as she reports in a letter, quote, "with tears of awe and gratitude and reverence, as if the poem had been meant for her after all," whereas Berryman's peers largely regarded the poem as Berryman's first triumph and self-assertion or insertion into a definitively American poetic canon. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions if people have them.
I'm going to check my note here for a minute. Just why bookliness instead of bookishness?
Thank you for asking that question, because I did consider bookishness, but that has all these other kind of chimes, right? It sounds, if you call you can call a person bookish, right? And that means they're a bookworm or maybe even a little pedantic. And I think that's the opposite of 77 Dream Songs, you know. Bookliness to me rings like shapeliness, which I think is closer to the way it feels to me. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It does. You need a little more definition in there. That beautiful definition was missing. That would have made me happier as you went along.
I'll put it in.
Thank you. All four presentations were terrific. I have wrestled with all the questions that you have. I have put together a play. I've always seen the Dream Songs as a play. And I've put together a play based on the Dream Songs called Homage to Henry, a dramatization of John Berryman's Dream Songs with permission from the Berryman estate and Farrar Straus Giroux. And I'd be glad to talk to anybody about it. But the idea of trying to find structure in the Dream Songs is particularly important, I think. My attempt was to put all 385 up on the wall and try and walk around and say, this should go first, this should go first, this should go first. And to me, that's a fascinating exercise that anybody who's willing to take apart their book and get those 385 should go through. It seems to me there isn't a shape to it, that they got away from him. And he let them get away from him, and we should be glad they got away from him. And we can impose our own shape on it. And any comments any of you would have on that, I'd be glad to hear.
Well, obviously, I agree with you. I mean, it seems to me that that desire to impose structure was one that really kind of misunderstood the nature of the dream songs, which was, one that couldn't be shapely in the typical ways that we expect long books, epic books, long poems to be shapely, but that another kind of shape emerges. Several other kinds of shapes emerge. And one of the things, I'm really interested in the play that you put together, because one of the things I wanted to talk about, many things I wanted to talk about, but one is that notion of like the theatrical as a kind of, I always think about how Adrienne Rich talks about form in her early work, was kind of like, it was sort of like asbestos gloves for dealing with difficult material. And I kind of think of the theatrical and the dream songs similarly, that it allowed him to deal with like really difficult personal material with a kind of distance. Like, so.
And then it gets into Mr. Bones.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
And I think one of the structures in the book, like in C.D. Wright's book, are these, the aspects of voice and the phrases that come back and back, how he keeps saying, pal, yeah, pal. That comes back and back and back and back in the book. And I know the 77 more than the nearly 400, so. But that seems like a really strong structure, and I don't know, I never craved any more structure than the structures that are there, so it's kind of shocking that people did, because to me it seems really complete. He longs to go on a journey, to be transported, and then becomes filled with despair as he's caught between things and is never able to get to a place or a city or country that satisfies him. I don't know.
Well, I think he struggled with structure so deeply, actually, of the book. He had like at least 15 different ideas about how to structure them according to different sort of traditional classical notions of structure for long poems, et cetera. But to me, there's a definite structure in the sense that it is Berryman moving throughout the world, but what kind of structure is that? It's not a traditional, conventional structure in the same way that a lot of epic sort of poems have been, even though it's a journey of a certain kind. But he's mad, he's mad, as he says, so the journey can't be one that is, I think, very typical in that sense. But
I think it might be seen, though, as I said, as a novelesque or a fictional structure. And it also, the structure of it, and I also kind of am surprised because I always thought of it as a very shapely group of poems, but it reminds me of the shape and structure of the cantos, too. And and I guess that structure would be, come back enough times to something and a shape emerges, and it's not a traditional shape, and it's maybe not a comfortable shape or an easy shape, but maybe that means it's up to the reader to accommodate a new kind of shape.
right.
Just one comment, and that is that in trying to put a shape to it, in trying to put a shape to it and using the 385, I chose number 1 to start with and number 77 to end with. So that in the first 77, it seemed that he did come to an end. I don't think you can have a better ending than 77. But even inserting all the other hundreds within it, I ended up using about 90 for the play. I ended with 77, so it was the beginning and the end of the 77.
Was your play ever produced?
Well, we're still waiting. Actually, Christopher Ricks had me do it for the Association of Literary Critics and Scholars at BU, and I did it as a benefit at the Oberon Theater recently. And actually, Mark Shore and I are doing it at the Mass Poetry Festival in May at the Peabody Essex Museum. And I'm looking for more opportunities if anybody is interested.
I just really had more of a comment than a question. And it's been ages since, this is revisiting Berryman for me. It's been ages since I studied him, like 1993. But I really loved how the panel moved in theme. Initially, Joy Katz, you were talking about rhythm, and I was thinking, maybe considering the racial voice as a retrieving of rhythm, and then you picked that up as rhythm and solidity, the lyricism and the book form, and then the next with rigidity and plasticity, and then Heather completing it with maybe a psychological insight to some things. And I love about Berryman that there's this constant superposition of rhythms and then non-rhythms. Like, what can we say? And I just love the way that the panel was put together for that. Did anybody have any comments on that? That he seems to need to establish the lyrical constantly, can't hold on to that, needs to establish structure constantly, continually. He's like a quantum physicist here. Can't establish that.
I'll just say that I think there are a few critics who have given us some different ways of thinking about rhythm in connection with Berryman, and one reading that I've always admired of the Dream Songs is Helen Vendler's, and she talks about considering each song to basically stand in for what she calls a Freudian hour of therapy, and the periodic nature of psychotherapy lends a certain coherence to the Dream Songs. I think it's also interesting to think of them as both dreams and songs, and the musical qualities of refrain and reprise that we hear in them, and also the way in which dreams can float into our living life and daydreams, and then back again to the nocturnal hours. To me, there are rhythms, but they're almost subliminal, and they're of the kind that you might encounter. I've never undergone analysis, but in an analytic setting, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want that. One of the things I wanted to get into more, which I didn't have time for, was the dream as a potential model for the structure, which is to say that, like, the dream is a place in which this sort of like amalgamation can happen. So that to begin with those three fragmented epigraphs and to ask us to grapple with their fragmentation is to kind of initiate a sort of access or sort of in-between space between dream and waking, where we try to make sense of the fragment and naturally by doing so creating some kind of narrative out of it. So that's in many ways how I see the Dream Songs moving, in the sense that there's this notion of fragment that the reader is initiated into working with, and the dream is definitely, I think, a model for that, and for Berryman obviously, but for all of us, we, I think, experience dreams in that way. So it's something that we can understand as a potential model for that structure, but
not a license. I want to, reel it back in just a little bit, only thinking of my students who say, but it's a dream poem, so I can do anything. But there are these recurring structures, and there's a set of voices. So you can see its sort of boundedness, even though it's wild and insane and a nut house. You can kind of anticipate what's going to happen, or not what's going to happen, but there seem to be this, there's a set of characters and various things that happen again and again So if my student wanted to say, well, then I get to write dream songs and anything I say goes, then I would say, well, okay, but look at this and this and this. Mm-hmm. Not to disagree with you, but to have the imaginary argument with and my students who aren't here.
Can I get one more? But would you, any or all of you, agree that some of the poems are just way out there, that they don't fit with anything else, that you can't figure out what's going on, and everybody might have their own candidates for those, and that you just have to kind of glide through and go to the next one?
absolutely. I mean, I think one of the problems that we're having maybe here too is we're talking about 77 dream songs versus 385 dream songs, and it's really important to make that distinction. But I think that a lot of them they're not dealing. I mean, we're kind of, again, I feel like we're kind of going back to the contextual. Well, there are characters and there's a narrative, but see that, like, to me, that's not the only way of understanding a kind of cohesiveness in the book. So ultimately, I mean, rather than what is going on in the book, I'm interested in how, like how the book makes meaning as opposed to what it means. Yeah. And so ultimately, I mean, I think that there are tons of dream songs that seem to not fit, that seem to like not contribute to what we would think of as any kind of narrative or any kind of story being told, but in fact are themselves songs, and they justify their own existence as such.
Also, at one point in the 300, I don't know, it's like song 270 something, the black the unnamed black friend says, I am leaving, this doesn't make any sense, and then disappears from the book, makes one tiny little cameo after that, and has to exit in a very theatrical way, just like you said.